Good morning. I would like to call this meeting to order. Good morning and welcome to the boardroom of the National Transportation Safety Board. I am Christopher Hart, and it is my privilege to serve as chairman of the NTSB. Joining me are Vice Chairman Bella Denzar, Member Robert Sumwalt, and Member Earl Weiner. Today we meet in open session as required by the Government in the Sunshine Act to consider the collision of a truck-tractor semi-trailer with a medium-sized bus in Davis, Oklahoma on September 26, 2014. The truck-tractor crossed over a median and struck the midsection of the bus, which was carrying 15 passengers of the North Central Texas College softball team. Tragically, 4 members of the team died. The remaining occupants of the bus were injured, as were the drivers of both the bus and the truck. On behalf of my fellow board members and the entire NTSB staff, I would like to extend our sincerest condolences to the family and friends of the 4 passengers who died. Nothing can replace your loved ones, but we hope that this investigation helps us discover new ways of preventing such crashes and reinforces previously identified opportunities to improve safety. I would also like to extend our wishes for a full recovery to those who were injured. In a moment, staff will describe the details of the crash sequence and other facts that were learned in our thorough investigation. We will examine issues as diverse as guidelines for the placement of median barriers, the insufficient occupant protection provided by the medium-sized bus, and the need for vehicle data recorders that can aid investigators immensely in determining what causes crashes and how to prevent them. We will also discuss a time-proven safety technology that could have reduced the terrible toll of the Davis crash, the seatbelt. For decades, we have understood that the single most important step that we can take to reduce deaths and mitigate injuries in highway crashes is to use available seatbelts, whether in a family car, a bus, or any other vehicle. Yet for a third time this year, we will be hearing about a major highway crash that we investigated in which passengers did not use available restraints. Today, we will also hear that this pattern was compounded by the inaccessibility and poor condition of some of the seatbelts on the bus. And we will turn to another issue, the full extent of which we are only beginning to understand: drug use in transportation. The truck driver's possession and use of synthetic cannabinoids is a grim example of this burgeoning and complex problem. Because of this evolving safety issue, the NTSB's most wanted list of safety improvements no longer includes only drinking and driving. We now advocate for ending any impairment in transportation. To date, many efforts to protect the driving public from drivers who are under the influence of drugs have been modeled on the decades-long fight against alcohol-impaired driving. But alcohol is only one impairing substance. By contrast, there are thousands of potentially impairing drugs. They might be recreational drugs, prescription drugs, or even over-the-counter drugs. In commercial transportation, regulations still focus on testing operators for a few specific substances. Drivers may be tested when they are hired, at various intervals thereafter, randomly, or after a crash. But this testing is helpful only if the driver is being tested for an impairing substance that he used. The truck driver in this crash was not tested for the drug that he had used until 4 young people lost their lives and several others were injured. And even if this drug were added to the list of substances for which drivers are tested, a slight change in its formula would yield yet another substance that a driver could use without detection. Today we will examine whether traditional testing provides adequate protection against impairment in transportation, given the complexity of the issue of drug driving. These factors and others converge to create the tragic outcomes that we will hear about this morning. If one or more of the factors had been different on the night of the crash, 4 young people might be alive today. Accordingly, we will discuss ways to prevent such crashes in the future and to strengthen the protection of passengers in those crashes that still do occur. Now, Deputy Managing Director Steve Kleist will introduce the staff. Mr. Kleist.
Thank you, Chairman Hart. Seated at the lead table is Dr. Robert Malloy, Acting Director of the Office of Highway Safety, Dr. Ensar Becic, Project Manager, Jennifer Morrison, the Investigator in Charge, Dennis Collins for Human Performance, Dr. Nick Webster, Medical Officer, and Mike Fox, Motor Carrier. Seated directly behind Mr. Fox is George Howell-Popoulos for Recorders, Dr. Kristen Poland, Vehicle Performance, Ronald Kaminsky, Survival Factors, Julie Perot, Safety Recommendations, Jim Ritter, Deputy Director of the Office of Research and Engineering, Ms. Ann Gewalt, Deputy General Counsel, and Sharon Bryson, Director of the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. The third table, directly behind Ms. Bryson, is Mark Banyard, who will be handling audio visuals and timing, Dr. Janet Price, Chief of the Report Development Division, Deborah Stocker, Editor, Shane Lack, Vehicle Performance, Stephen Prouty, Vehicle Performance, and Daniel Walsh, Highway Factors. The investigator in charge, Jennifer Morrison, will have the opening presentation.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Hart, Vice Chairman Denzar, and members of the board. This morning, staff will present an investigation of a median crossover collision that occurred near Davis, Oklahoma. This median crossover crash occurred on Friday evening, September 26, 2014, at about 9:05 p.m. The crash occurred in a rural area on Interstate 35 in the Arbuckle Mountains near Davis, Oklahoma, which is about midway between Oklahoma City and the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Involved in this crash was a northbound 2013 Peterbilt truck tractor in combination with a 2014 Great Dane refrigerated semi-trailer. It was being operated by Quickway Transportation Incorporated and occupied by a 53-year-old driver. Also involved in the crash was a southbound 2008 Champion Defender 32-passenger medium-sized bus, occupied by a 48-year-old driver and 15 passengers from the North Central Texas College softball team. The truck had departed the Quickway terminal in Fort Worth, Texas, the starting point for the day's trip, at around 3:30 p.m. and was traveling to Chandler, Oklahoma from its previous stop in Irving, Texas. The bus was returning to Gainesville, Texas, where the college was located, following a softball scrimmage in Bethany, Oklahoma. The bus had departed Bethany around 6:15 p.m. This image shows a view of the roadway departure looking southbound into the oncoming path of the northbound truck. Although this image depicts daytime conditions, the crash occurred in darkness, when after negotiating a slight rightward curve near milepost 47, the truck departed the left travel lane, crossed rumble strips, and entered a 100-foot wide depressed earthen median at an approximate 2-degree angle. This image looks northbound along the truck's path through the median. The truck continued through the median at an approximate speed of 72 to 73 miles per hour, traveling over 1,100 feet through the various elevations of the median and traversing a gravel crossover area. There was no evidence that the driver attempted to take corrective action, such as steering or braking, during the path through the median. The truck then entered the southbound lanes of I-35 at an approximate 9-degree angle and collided with the left side of the bus. Following the collision, the bus rolled 1/4 turn onto its right side. The truck continued off the roadway another 300 feet into a wooded area, finally being stopped by large trees. Data from the truck indicated that the accelerator pedal was being depressed at nearly full throttle after the impact with the bus. We will now show an animation providing 2 different views of the crash sequence. For those in the audience or viewing the webcast who do not wish to view the animation and subsequent photos, we will pause momentarily for you to leave the room or turn away from your computer monitor. The presentation will resume following the animation. Recall that the crash occurred in darkness. The animation does not depict the lighting condition or visibility at the time of the crash. Please play the animation. This view shows the truck northbound in the left lane of Interstate 35. The truck departs the travel lane and traverses the 100-foot wide median before entering the southbound lanes and striking the left side of the bus. This view shows the bus southbound on Interstate 35. Just after the third lane ends and merges into the two travel lanes, the truck is shown approaching in the median. The impact then occurs, causing the bus to roll over onto its right side. Pictured on this slide are photographs of both vehicles at final rest, with a bus on its right side and the tractor semi-trailer combination unit off into the woods. As a result of this crash, 4 of the 15 passengers on the medium-sized bus died. 5 sustained serious injuries and 6 received minor injuries. Each of the drivers also sustained minor injuries. This slide lists the on-scene investigative staff. Member Robert Sumwalt was the member on scene. This slide lists additional staff that supported the investigation on scene. This slide lists the report development staff. The parties to the investigation were the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Quickway Transportation Incorporated, and PACCAR Incorporated, which was the manufacturer of the 2013 Peterbilt truck tractor involved in the crash. After assessing the events of this crash, staff identified the following safety issues: the truck driver's drug use, passenger restraint systems, crashworthiness of medium-sized buses, vehicle data recording, and median barriers. Mr. Collins has the next presentation on human performance, unless the board has any questions at this time.
No questions. Please proceed.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Morrison. Good morning. In this presentation, I will cover the human performance factors associated with a bus driver, including exclusions, the human performance factors associated with the truck driver, including exclusions, and the evidence pointing to the use of a synthetic cannabinoid by the truck driver. The driver of the bus was properly licensed for his vehicle and had experience with both the vehicle and the route. The driver was not using his cellular telephone for calls or text messaging at the time of the crash. The driver had obtained adequate sleep in the 3 nights preceding the crash. Toxicology and the bus driver's medical records did not indicate any issues relevant to the crash. In short, staff was able to exclude all human performance factors associated with the driver of the medium-sized bus as either causal or contributory in this crash. Following the crash, the driver of the truck provided a written statement to police which indicated he was retrieving a can of soda from a cooler when he felt the truck drift into the median. He stated he was unable to control the truck and ended up in some brush. He made no mention of striking the bus in this statement. Recall from Ms. Morrison's presentation that the truck traveled over 1,100 feet in the median without any evidence of steering or braking, and that data from the truck indicates the accelerator was nearly fully depressed after impact with the bus. The driver's claim of reaching for a soft drink is inconsistent with the physical evidence and does not account for the total lack of corrective action taken by the driver. Staff considered other sources of distraction as factors and determined the driver was not using his cellular telephone at the time of the crash. No evidence of other distractions, inside or outside the vehicle, was found. Staff then considered fatigue as a factor in the crash, but were able to determine the driver had adequate time available for rest in the days preceding the crash. Staff notes the physical evidence and total lack of response are inconsistent with either a distracted or fatigued driver. Finally, a review of the driver's medical history, prescriptions, over-the-counter medications, and post-crash toxicology results resulted in staff excluding medical conditions as factors. The Oklahoma Highway Patrol recovered a small, silver-colored pipe containing a burnt residue from the floor of the truck. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation analyzed the residue and determined it contained a synthetic cannabinoid known as 5-fluoro-AMB. Further detail on synthetic cannabinoids and their effects will be given by Dr. Webster in his presentation immediately following this one. Shortly after the crash, the truck driver's supervisor at a previous employer contacted NTSB investigators. This individual reported he had observed signs of declining work performance in the driver, including missing work, lethargy, and forgetfulness. The supervisor stated he talked to the driver, who admitted using K2, another synthetic cannabinoid, but the driver insisted the substance was legal and would not appear on Department of Transportation drug tests. Investigators obtained records from the truck driver's medical providers and discovered the driver's wife had called his primary care physician, stating the driver was smoking K2, could not leave it alone, and was having what she described as seizure-like behavior. Records from a counselor indicated the driver stated he was using synthetic drugs, including while working as a commercial driver. To summarize, staff was able to exclude all human performance factors associated with the bus driver as causal or contributory in the crash. The truck driver's statement to police is inconsistent with the physical evidence and does not explain his total lack of response. Distraction, fatigue, medications, and medical conditions were ruled out as factors for the truck driver based on the available evidence. The truck driver had a history of synthetic cannabinoid use, both in general and at work as a commercial driver, and a synthetic cannabinoid was present in a pipe found in the truck during a post-crash search. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Nick Webster will continue discussing synthetic cannabinoids and their effects.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Dr. Webster, please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning. I will discuss the issues associated with a dangerous new class of drugs, synthetic cannabinoids, and the role one specific drug played in this accident. Synthetic cannabinoids are a large family of compounds that stimulate the same brain receptors as tetrahydrocannabinol, commonly referred to as THC, the main active ingredient in marijuana. These compounds were first synthesized in the early 1980s to study these brain receptors and the effects of stimulating them. But the research was abandoned because of serious and dangerous side effects. These are not natural substitutes for marijuana, and the effects of individual synthetic drugs may vary significantly. Synthetic cannabinoids are primarily manufactured overseas and shipped into the United States as chemical imports with no legitimate medical or industrial use. The chemicals are applied to dried plant materials, packaged and sold in shops like gas stations and convenience stores, as well as over the internet, misleadingly identified as herbal incense or potpourri. The packages are often labeled not for human consumption, although users typically smoke the product. These chemicals are marketed under hundreds of different enticing brand names, including Spice, K2, and Mellow Mood. However, synthetic cannabinoids are products of illicit manufacturing operations that lack controls to prevent contamination or ensuring consistent concentrations of the drug in each package. As a result, identically branded packages may contain different concentrations of the same drug or totally different drugs. Overall, the effects of smoking these drugs are unpredictable, may be different, and frequently are worse than the effects of smoking marijuana. A user may experience effects ranging from mild euphoric high to an overdose resulting in psychosis, non-responsiveness, seizures, or even death. In fact, the CDC reported calls to poison control centers for adverse symptoms relating to synthetic cannabinoid use increased 330% between January and April of 2015. A small number of deaths have been reported from the use of these drugs, but the numbers are misleading because most jurisdictions cannot effectively test for the substances. This new class of dangerous drugs became generally available in the United States in the last 10 years. Approximately 170 different synthetic cannabinoids have been officially identified by law enforcement agencies. Many more, likely hundreds more, have yet to be fully described. The Drug Enforcement Administration identifies potentially dangerous drugs and places them into 5 schedules based on their potential for medical use and their likelihood of abuse. Drugs with no medical use and a high potential for abuse are placed in Schedule 1. However, the process of evaluating and scheduling takes some time. There are currently 25 synthetic cannabinoids listed in Schedule 1. After the DEA places an existing drug into Schedule 1, the manufacturer can modify the structure to produce something that is new. As a result, law enforcement agencies are chasing an elusive target. As reported by Mr. Collins, the investigation identified a pipe containing the residue that tested positive for 5-fluoro-AMB. These 2 images depict the chemical structure of 2 different synthetic cannabinoids. The structure on the left is 5-fluoro-AMB. It is not listed as a Schedule 1 drug. The structure on the right is ADP Pinaca, which is a Schedule 1 drug. The circles show the areas of change to the molecule. These 2 very similar chemicals may have quite different effects on users, and each requires unique testing standards. NTSB staff asked the DEA to evaluate 5-fluoro-AMB to determine if it had similar properties to other Schedule 1 synthetic cannabinoids. The DEA determined that because of its similarities to other Schedule 1 drugs, 5-fluoro-AMB may be treated as a Schedule 1 drug under federal law if it is intended for human consumption. Detection of 5-fluoro-AMB poses problems common to all newly identified synthetic cannabinoids. Its analysis is far more difficult than testing for THC, the impairing drug in marijuana. There is abundant research into THC, including how the body breaks it down, what breakdown products, also known as metabolites, are created, and how long each lingers in the body. Labs can easily identify the parent compound THC and its metabolites even days after marijuana use, and reference standards are readily available from confirmatory testing. However, there is very limited information about 5-fluoro-AMB and no information about its metabolites or how quickly the drug is removed from the blood. Therefore, testing laboratories can only identify the parent compound, even though the compound may linger for only a few minutes or hours. The truck driver's blood was collected by the Oklahoma Highway Patrol approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes after the accident. Toxicology identified the truck driver's known medications. Testing conducted by a specialized laboratory at the University of California detected a peak that could correlate with 5-fluoro-AMB, but because of some signal-to-noise ratio and other confirmatory factors were outside acceptable parameters for testing, the testing was unable to confirm the presence or absence of 5-fluoro-AMB in the truck driver's blood. In summary, synthetic cannabinoids are powerful, dangerous drugs with unpredictable effects ranging from euphoria to non-responsiveness and occasionally death. The truck driver had a history of synthetic cannabinoid use with reported seizure-like activity and use while on duty at his prior job. The pipe found in the truck tested positive for 5-fluoro-AMB, but blood testing of samples collected hours later was unable to confirm the presence or absence of the substance. During the accident sequence, the truck driver did not initiate corrective actions during the 11 seconds as the truck crossed the median. This lack of action provides evidence of his non-responsiveness. Additionally, there was no evidence to support alternate explanations such as fatigue, medical conditions, or effects from medications as a cause for his non-responsiveness. Based on this information, the truck driver's lack of corrective actions were due to incapacitation, likely stemming from the use of synthetic cannabinoids. Thank you. Mr. Mike Fox will now discuss issues associated with synthetic cannabinoids in commercial transportation.
Thank you, Dr. Webster. Mr. Fox.
Good morning. In my presentation, I will discuss the issues of synthetic cannabinoids in commercial transportation. I will continue to highlight some of the unique challenges of synthetic drugs, as previously mentioned by Mr. Collins and Dr. Webster, and specifically address their effect on commercial drivers and current DOT drug testing procedures. This presentation will review the compliance of the motor carriers that employed the truck driver, a review of the current Department of Transportation testing requirements under 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 382 and Part 40, highlight the disconnect between synthetic cannabinoids and DOT testing, indicate that research is needed to determine how prolific synthetic drugs are among commercial motor vehicle drivers, and suggest that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and industry stakeholders develop new testing procedures and solutions for these substances. At the time of the crash, the accident driver was employed by Quickway Transportation. This investigation determined that Quickway Transportation had properly qualified and drug tested the accident driver under the federal regulations. Overall, Quickway Transportation random drug and alcohol testing program met or exceeded the regulatory requirements. The NTSB also investigated the accident driver's previous employer, Big Star Trucking. Investigators determined that Big Star Trucking was also compliant with the federal drug testing requirements. While employed by both motor carriers, the accident driver was subject to 3 DOT drug tests and 1 non-DOT drug test, all of which were negative. Part 382 details the federal requirements for drug and alcohol testing procedures. Part 382 mandates 5 testing procedures. Those procedures include pre-employment, random drug and alcohol testing, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, and other tests as required. Under the current DOT testing procedures, urine is required for drug testing and a breath sample is used for alcohol testing. As previously stated, these motor carriers who employed the accident driver were in compliance with these regulations. In 1991, Congress passed the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act, requiring DOT agencies to implement drug and alcohol testing. Part 40 applies to all DOT required testing, regardless of the mode of transportation. According to these regulations, drug and alcohol testing applies to employees who drive commercial trucks and buses that require a commercial driver's license. Part 40.85 states that DOT laboratories are required to test for the following 5 classes of drugs: marijuana metabolites, cocaine metabolites, amphetamines, opiate metabolites, and PCP. Under 382.213, no driver shall report or remain on duty while using any Schedule I drug. Section 392.4 also prohibits the use of Schedule I drugs as well as any substance that renders a driver incapable of operating a CMV. There is a disconnect between the drug prohibitions for CMV drivers and the substances for which they are screened. Under the current DOT testing requirements of 40.85, synthetic cannabinoids are not tested. Users of synthetic or other drugs are not tested under 40.85 could exploit and use these substances as demonstrated by the truck driver involved in this crash. Currently, there is no data on the prevalence of synthetic drug use among CMV drivers. Research is necessary to determine how prolific synthetic drugs are among commercial drivers. Staff is proposing a recommendation in this area. Part 382.603 covers reasonable suspicion training for supervisors. Carriers must provide at least 1 hour of supervisor training for detection of potential drug or alcohol impairment. Although the training is required to include physical, behavioral, and speech indicators of impairment, it is very short and does not require recurrent training. According to a recent FMCSA survey, only 15.7% of the reasonable suspicion drug tests resulted in a positive test. The low number of positive test results indicates either ineffective reasonable suspicion training or, more likely, driver impairment due to substances not tested under 40.85. It is quite possible that reasonable suspicion training is insufficient to detect impairment due to the use of synthetic drugs. FMCSA and industry stakeholders could collaborate on creating new solutions for detection and intervention on this problem. Potential solutions may consist of any of the following. First, motor carriers should educate their drivers about the dangers of synthetic drugs. Additionally, FMCSA and industry could develop performance-based tests for evaluating drivers' ability to operate a commercial motor vehicle. Law enforcement successfully utilizes drug recognition experts, or DREs, who are trained for detecting driver impairment. DRE training enables the courts to prove impairment in the absence of a positive test. Additionally, expanded authority may be required to help tackle the disparity between 40.85 and the use of synthetic drugs. Furthermore, driver-facing cameras could also be used as a tool to help carriers in detection of impairment. Staff is proposing recommendations in this area. In summary, the motor carriers that employed the accident driver were in compliance with DOT testing requirements. Under the current DOT testing requirements of 40.85, synthetic drugs are not tested. Synthetic drugs are widely available in retail stores, truck stops, and on the internet. Research is needed to determine how widespread synthetic drug use is among commercial drivers. Lastly, FMCSA and industry stakeholders need to collaborate on developing a plan for performance-based testing and other procedures for detecting and deterring use of synthetic drugs with commercial drivers. This concludes my presentation. I'll be followed by Mr. Ronald Kaminsky, who will be presenting survival factors.
We'll give you a few minutes to reshuffle. Thank you. Please proceed.
Good morning. In this presentation, I will discuss several issues that the Survival Factors investigation discovered. The medium-sized bus was equipped with seat belts, but only the driver was restrained, and none of the bus passengers were wearing the available lap belts. The North Central Texas College had a seatbelt use policy, but it was not enforced.
Could you bring the microphone just a little bit closer?
Sure.
Thank you.
And lastly, buses like the medium-sized bus involved in this crash are excluded from state primary or secondary enforcement seatbelt laws. The bus was equipped with a lap and shoulder belt for the driver and lap belts only at all passenger seating positions. Based on interviews with the driver and the surviving student passengers, the driver was restrained, but none of the 15 passengers were using their seatbelts. The student passengers stated that they had never received any instructions about using the lap belts on this trip or previous trips. In addition, most students stated that they were not even aware that the bus was equipped with lap belts. This slide shows a seating chart of occupants inside the bus at the time of the crash. As a result of this crash, 4 passengers indicated in red were fatally injured. The 3 fatally injured passengers on the left side were all fully ejected, while the passenger on the right was partially ejected. 5 passengers sustained serious injuries, and the bus driver and 6 passengers suffered minor injuries. The top 2 photos on this slide illustrate the inaccessibility of the seat belts on the bus. The photo on the left shows the webbing and the buckle portion tucked under the corner of the seat cushion. The photo on the right shows how one of the seat belts was wrapped around the seat frame. The bottom photo shows damage found to the webbing of a seat belt, indicating the lack of proper maintenance. In addition to mitigating injury-causing forces, seat belts prevent drivers and passengers from being thrown from their seats and ejected during a crash. People not wearing seat belts are 30 times more likely to be ejected from a vehicle, and more than 75% of people ejected during a fatal crash die as a result of their injuries. Had the lap belts been well maintained, accessible, and properly worn, they would have kept the passengers in their seats, preventing ejection and reducing overall injuries. The lack of seatbelt use likely worsened the injuries to the passengers in the bus. As previously mentioned, the North Central Texas College had a seatbelt use policy, and the driver of the bus was required to and did sign a document agreeing to not only use his seatbelt, but also require all passengers to wear their seatbelts and not to operate the vehicle unless all passengers were properly restrained. Unfortunately, the accident bus driver did not adhere to this signed document and allowed his passengers to go unrestrained and even lie down across the seats. At the time of the crash, the college had no procedure in place to ensure that its drivers complied with the policy. Since the crash, NCTC has established new policies to prevent this from happening again. They now require all drivers to review and sign the school policy document yearly and acknowledge on the vehicle sign-out card that they will have reminded passengers to wear their seatbelts on each trip. However, the circumstances of this crash raise concerns about other schools of higher education and their access to comprehensive travel procedures. The National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, has developed a transportation safety guide for its members, titled Safety in Student Transportation, a Resource Guide for Colleges and Universities. One chapter explains how to minimize the risk of injury by requiring that anyone traveling on a school-sponsored trip or for institutional business use a seatbelt. The NCAA provided this document to all NCAA member colleges and universities, but because North Central Texas College is a junior college, they were unaware of the guide. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. School policies may increase seatbelt use in buses used for school-related activities, but state laws have a broader, more comprehensive effect. As of today, 34 states, including Oklahoma and Texas and the District of Columbia, have primary enforcement seatbelt laws for front seat occupants. In 2014, seatbelt usage in states with primary enforcement was nearly 90%, compared with 82% in the states with secondary enforcement. Besides seatbelt usage, primary enforcement seatbelt laws have also been associated with a reduction in fatalities. For example, when Minnesota introduced the primary enforcement in 2009, they experienced a 10% reduction in fatalities. Yet state seatbelt use laws, whether primary or secondary enforcement, do not extend to motor coaches and medium-sized buses. For almost 50 years, the NTSB has advocated legislation requiring the use of seatbelts in commercial and passenger vehicles. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has also recognized the benefits of passenger restraint systems in motor coaches and certain buses, as evidenced by the recent rulemaking on occupant crash protection, which will go into effect in 2016. NHTSA research showed that seatbelt assemblies installed on motor coach passenger seats could reduce the risk of fatal injuries and rollover crashes by 77%, primarily by preventing ejections. Although state seatbelt use laws apply to light vehicles, the definition of such vehicles varies among the states. For example, seatbelt use laws in Texas also apply to vans with a capacity of up to 15 occupants, to trucks, and to truck tractors, while seatbelt laws in Oklahoma do not apply to those vehicles. Extending the mandatory seatbelt use laws with primary enforcement to all vehicles in all states for all seating positions would decrease fatalities on the road, and a recommendation has been proposed in this area. In summary, the North Central Texas College bus was equipped with lap belts for the passengers, but none of the passengers were wearing them, and the seat belts were not well maintained or accessible. North Central Texas College had a seatbelt requirement for the driver and student passengers, but the driver did not enforce the school's seatbelt policies, and the college never followed up to ensure the requirements were being enforced. Seatbelts save lives, and primary enforcement of seatbelt use laws increases the use of seatbelts. Therefore, mandatory seatbelt use laws for all vehicles and all seating positions are needed to improve safety and decrease fatalities. A passenger restraint system, whether in a passenger vehicle, motor coach, or medium-sized bus, is only effective when used. This concludes my presentation, and the next presenter will be Dr. Kristen Poland, and she will be discussing medium-sized bus crashworthiness.
Thank you, Mr. Kaminsky. Dr. Poland, please proceed.
Good morning. During this presentation, I will give an overview on the crashworthiness of medium-sized buses, including previous NTSB recommendations and the lack of applicable federal standards. I'll then discuss the design of the bus involved in this crash, along with the outcomes of the collision and rollover. Crashworthiness can be defined as the ability of a vehicle to protect its occupants from injury resulting from crash forces. Medium-sized buses, like the one involved in this crash, are not required to meet a minimum level of crashworthiness. For example, Medium-sized buses are not required to have a minimum roof strength or a crash-worthy sidewall structure to ensure survival space during a side impact or rollover. Advanced window systems, which could retain the window during a crash and reduce the risk of ejection, are also not required. Further, occupant protection systems, such as seat belts, are only required for the driver, not the passengers. Previously, the NTSB recognized that passengers in these medium-sized buses are at risk during these severe crashes. In addition, staff understands that these medium-sized buses often operate in a manner and environment similar to motor coaches. As a result, the NTSB has asked NHTSA to include all medium-sized buses in their rulemaking for improved rollover structural integrity, window retention, and occupant protection standards that currently focus exclusively on motor coaches and heavy buses. Despite our past efforts, these medium-sized buses are still unprotected. In fact, if designed next year, this medium-sized bus would be 1 pound under the required gross vehicle weight rating for the new motor coach and heavy bus standards, and therefore those new requirements would not apply. Because there are no required standards, some medium-sized bus manufacturers apply school bus roof strength and joint strength standards to medium-sized buses in an effort to improve their crashworthiness. These standards were applied to this bus design, although it did not meet all the school bus standards' minimum requirements. Further, lap belts were installed, as we have learned, but the belts were not all in good condition and none were worn. During the crash sequence, the tractor-trailer impacted the bus's left sidewall, causing the sidewall joints and panels to separate. There was also intrusion along the sidewall, resulting in the loss of the windows on the left side as well. During the impact and the subsequent rollover, the bus lost almost all the windows on the right side, too. The loss of the sidewall panels and the windows exposed the occupants to a high risk of injury and ejection. Due to the lack of belt use and these large openings, 4 passengers were either fully or partially ejected and fatally injured. In summary, there is a need for medium-sized buses to be crashworthy and to have well-designed and accessible restraint systems. Crashworthiness can be improved by requiring these vehicles to meet the existing motor coach occupant protection standards and the proposed rollover structural integrity standards. This crash further emphasized the need for these buses to protect passengers in severe side impact crashes. Because of the lack of side impact protection standards for medium-sized buses, passengers are at risk of injury and ejection. As a result, staff has proposed recommendations in this area. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. Mr. George Haralampopoulos will now discuss vehicle data recorders.
Good morning. In the Davis investigation, there was limited information available for the reconstruction of the crash events. In this presentation, I will discuss the use of event data recorders in commercial vehicles. Both the truck and bus involved in this collision were equipped with an engine control module, or ECM, that had the capability of recording data. However, neither vehicle was equipped with, nor were they required to be equipped with, dedicated collision event data recorders, or EDRs. I will discuss the data sources available from the collision, limitations of the data available, and I will conclude with a discussion of previous NTSB recommendations addressing the implementation of dedicated EDRs in commercial vehicles. The commercial vehicles involved in this collision were equipped with engine control modules that were primarily used to regulate engine functions such as ignition timing and fuel delivery, as well as interface with other onboard electronic control systems. The ECM from the bus had no recording function and could only store fault codes that provided little or no information that could be attributed to the collision. The truck ECM contained a recording function capable of capturing pre- and post-crash data during sensor faults and triggered events such as a rapid deceleration. Potential data recorded included operator inputs, vehicle performance, and engine performance parameters. However, the opportunity to capture this data was missed due to a power interruption to the truck ECM during the crash sequence. Vehicle electronic systems are becoming more integrated and complex. The accident truck required 4 additional modules to communicate to the ECM. If any modules are damaged during a crash sequence, potential new faults can overwrite vital crash data to the ECM, increasing the probability of data loss. Furthermore, the modules contain minimal crash protection and data preservation in the event of a power loss. The following images show the location of each module required to perform an ECM download on the accident truck. This image shows the ECM stored at the front of the vehicle in the engine compartment. This image shows the after-treatment and fuel control modules stored at the right side fuel tank. This image shows the Bendix anti-lock braking and electronic stability control module, which was stored inside the dashboard. And this image shows the cab electronic control module, which was also stored inside the dashboard. As can be seen in these images, the modules in this investigation sustained minimal impact damage. However, the lack of crash survivability and data preservation standards leaves modules with recording functions open to the environment, increasing the possibility for data loss. The NTSB has long advocated for the use of data recording in all modes of transportation. Data recording is required in aviation, rail, and many maritime applications, and the NTSB has issued numerous recommendations regarding the use of event recorders in passenger cars, trucks, school buses, and motor coaches. In 1999, the NTSB made recommendations to NHTSA concerning the requirements and standards for EDRs and buses. These recommendations address the data parameters and survivability of dedicated event data recorders. In 2010, the NTSB made similar recommendations to NHTSA concerning requirements and standards for EDRs and heavy trucks. As of today, the status of these recommendations remains open on acceptable response. In summary, until minimum performance standards and crash survivability requirements for event data recorders are implemented, critical data will remain unavailable. The use of dedicated EDRs in commercial vehicles would greatly improve the data available to better understand heavy vehicle collision dynamics and improve the ability to advance commercial vehicle safety research. This concludes my presentation, and I will be followed by Mr. Dan Walsh, who will be presenting median barriers.
Thank you. A couple of minutes to reshuffle again. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. My presentation gives a brief overview of the I-35 median and the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials median barrier guidelines. I will also discuss the Oklahoma Department of Transportation median cable barrier guidelines that led to the planned installation of a new median cable barrier on I-35 in the vicinity of the crash. Finally, I will discuss a new National Cooperative Highway Research Project, NCHRP Project 22-31, that will include addressing heavy vehicle crossover median crashes. This photograph shows the travel path of the tractor-trailer left and right wheel paths through the I-35 median. The northbound and southbound travel lanes are also referenced on the photograph. The I-35 median width was approximately 100 feet wide, measured from the edges of travelway. An upgrade slope of 2.7% existed in the southbound lanes prior to the crash. This graphic illustrates the AASHTO guidelines for determining whether to install median barriers on high-speed roadways. Based on a combination of factors such as median width and average daily traffic, the guidelines are used by state DOTs to determine whether a median barrier is recommended, considered, or is optional at a particular location. Based on the site-specific characteristics of I-35 in the vicinity of the crash, using a 100-foot wide median and average daily traffic of 26,000 vehicles per day, a median barrier would be optional at this particular location. However, the guidelines are flexible to allow median barriers to be installed in the optional category based on a significant crash history. On October 28, 2014, after the crash, ODOT finalized its median cable barrier guidance. One of the guidelines addresses crash history at a location regardless of median width, as shown in the figure to the right. At the request of NTSB investigators, ODOT examined the median crossover crash history in the vicinity of the crash for the last 5 years. 4 median crossover crashes were reported within a 2.64-mile length, as shown by the red dashed line. ODOT acknowledged the 4 median crossover crashes met the crash history guideline and made a decision to install a median cable barrier at the crash site. Construction of the median cable barrier has started and is expected to be completed by January of 2016. As a result of a median crossover crash that occurred in Munfordville, Kentucky on March 26, 2010, and resulted in 11 fatalities, the NTSB issued 4 recommendations calling for the identification of median crossover crash rates and heavy vehicle traffic volume when determining the criteria for median barrier selection. 2 recommendations were issued to the Federal Highway Administration, and 2 recommendations were issued to AASHTO. These recommendations were issued with the aim of establishing implementation criteria for the selection and installation of median barriers capable of redirecting heavy vehicles. The recommendations are currently classified open, acceptable, response. The Transportation Research Board has initiated a new project this year, NCHRP Project 22-31, to develop median barrier guidelines. The project is estimated to be completed in June of 2018. These guidelines are expected to address the 4 NTSB recommendations from the Munfordville, Kentucky crash, in addition to addressing the selection and placement of median barriers capable of redirecting heavy vehicles. NTSB staff communicated the specific circumstances of the Davis, Oklahoma crash to TRB and AASHTO staff in a meeting earlier this year. Based on discussions at that meeting, TRB staff revised the work plan for the project to address heavy vehicle crossover median crashes that includes looking at historical crash data, heavy vehicle crossover frequency, and traffic volumes. In summary, NCHRP Project 22-31 represents an opportunity over the next 3 years to research and generate valuable data to address heavy vehicle crossover median crashes. The 3-year wait time is a long period, particularly for the states that have not developed specific median barrier guidelines. Staff believes the circumstances of the median crossover crash in Davis, Oklahoma, together with the ODOT median cable barrier guidelines, could provide other state DOTs critical information to take provisional steps before the completion of NCHRP Project 22-31. Staff is proposing a new recommendation in this area and also proposes to reiterate the Munfordville, Kentucky recommendations to the Federal Highway Administration and AASHTO. This concludes staff's presentation. We would be happy to answer any questions the board may have at this time.
I would like to thank all of you for your comprehensive and thorough presentations. We will begin the question and answer session with Member Sumwalt.
Thank you, and good morning. Ms. Morrison, you mentioned that the driver the truck driver's previous employer had called the NTSB and reported that he had admitted there that he was using spice or K2, I think it actually. Now, as I recall from being on scene, that call came before it had been released, that publicly released, that he had found that the police had found a pipe in the cab. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that call came within the first few days while we were on scene.
Yeah, so that was a completely independent thing. It wasn't like someone was influenced by a media report of that. That was a completely independent report, which I would think would lend further validity to that report.
That's correct.
Let me ask you this. Is it possible that after bumping around through the median for 11 seconds, 10 or 11 seconds, and going over that gravel access road, crossover road, and then striking the bus, the accelerator of the car, of the 18-wheeler, remained depressed for a second and a half to 2 seconds after that? Is it possible that somehow or another the accelerator got stuck?
So what we do know about the accelerator pedal is that it was fully depressed at the 99% level after the impact with the bus. We don't have any data prior to that. We only have the 2 seconds of data after the impact with the bus.
Thank you very much. I want to talk now about seatbelt usage, and we have a patchwork of laws concerning seatbelt usage. It varies from state to state. It is indeed a state issue. We've got 32 states with primary enforcement, 17 with secondary enforcement, and one state, New Hampshire, has no seatbelt laws for adults. So basically, you can be driving down the interstate, cross the state border, and you would have a different state law pertaining to seatbelt usage. For example, in Texas, seatbelt laws apply to vans with a capacity of up to 18 occupants, as well as trucks and truck trailers. However, when you cross the border into Oklahoma, these seatbelt laws don't apply to these vehicles. So it could be argued then that there's a different level of safety from state to state. And I would say that the recommendations that staff is proposing today, if enacted by the states, will eliminate that discrepancy regarding seatbelts, regarding that different level of safety. It would make sure that people driving through our national highway system would have a similar law from state to state and not a different level of safety. So let me ask you this. Staff is proposing a recommendation, it's Recommendation 5, which says enact legislation. This is to all states and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Enact legislation that provides for primary enforcement of a mandatory seatbelt use law for all vehicle seating positions equipped with a passenger restraint system. If that were to be enacted across all 50 states, how many lives do we envision could be saved?
Well, according to statistics from 2013, of all the fatal crashes that occurred, had occupants 5 years and older been wearing their seatbelts, over 2,800 lives would have been saved.
So by having primary enforcement for all seating positions, we could save, throughout all our states, we could save about 2,800 lives each year. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Member Sumalt. Member Weiner?
Just to follow that on, can you define what primary enforcement means?
Is they're required to wear their seatbelts.
And how is that enforced?
A police officer, if he sees you not wearing your seatbelt, he can pull you over and ticket you.
So for all seating positions in a sedan, you can see all the seating positions, right?
Correct.
And an officer could see all of the seatbelts either being used or not being used.
That's correct.
Now, the college did have a policy for seatbelts to be used in all seating positions. Did it
Yes,
not?
Yes, sir.
So how would that be enforced?
Well, should have been, the coach, the school had the policies, and he was just allowing the students, he never informed them of the seat belts, and he didn't require them to wear them as he was supposed to.
But we're going to call for mandatory use of seatbelts in all seating positions. So how does that get enforced?
Member Weiner, I think you're bringing up an excellent point, and that's something that staff has also discussed, and I think it's a good point to bring up because I'm sure that conversation will happen outside of the boardroom when people start to evaluate this recommendation. Certainly when you talk about enforcing this primary seatbelt law with motor coaches, you could bring up the issues that you're talking about, that it's challenging to see all the seatbelt positions. It's challenging to look at who's responsible for ensuring that everyone is properly buckled. What we're looking at is that the Safety Board has long advocated for all people to be properly buckled if there is a seatbelt available in all vehicles. So this recommendation makes the NTSB's position very clear, that we think that if there is a seatbelt available on a vehicle, that people should be using it and using it properly. But we also recognize that the state laws provide a form of education for people. And so providing this type of education will help people to understand that whatever vehicle they're on, whether it's in the rear seat of their passenger car, or whether it's in a motor coach or a medium-sized bus, or even a school bus that's equipped with seatbelts, that they should be wearing those seatbelts and wearing them properly. But this is a first step. We recognize that the primary enforcement is going to give that education and also that background that will allow the operators to have some power with their enforcement. So when the operator requires the driver to enforce the seatbelt use law, the driver also has the ability to refer back to the state law. This is the law. You have to wear your seatbelt at all times while we're operating this vehicle. But as I said, it's a first step. So this is going to get us a certain percentage of people using their seatbelts. But we recognize we may need to look at this again. Maybe there's advanced technologies that need to be used either in these vehicles to help understand when the seatbelts are being used or not used, or maybe some other innovative techniques that police officers or law enforcement officers could use to be able to increase enforcement on these unique vehicles.
Yeah, there's no disagreement from my perspective in terms of the use of seatbelts being very positive in terms of saving lives. But primary enforcement is only one mechanism for doing that, and I think for something like a motor coach or a large bus, where you've got multiple seating positions that are not in the control or in the view of the person responsible, who that is, I think the driver. I think we need to be more clever in terms of advocating other ways, or at least the search for other ways to determine whether or not somebody who had the seatbelt on when the driver walked through and took a look, but who immediately unbuckled. You know, we've all been on airplanes where as soon as the seatbelt light goes on, we come through, the flight attendants come through and assure that everybody's buckled in. As soon as the attendant walks by, somebody unbuckles it because they just didn't like the seatbelt. And so I think we need to figure out better ways to do that.
Well, Member Weiner, I think that is true. You can't absolutely control people all the time. But one thing that the states have done, recognizing that, is many states have taken that responsibility directly to the passenger. That if you are a passenger over a certain age, 18 typically, the ticket will come to you. That is how it's handled with DC taxis right now. They inform you of the law, but if you get pulled over and you're not wearing your taxi, the ticket's written for the passenger. So there are ways to deal with some of the issues that you're talking about, and the states have actually already implemented some of those ways.
But I think the difficulty resides in how do you determine whether somebody is or is not buckled in when you can't see it.
And I think that's another issue again. One of the issues that we've looked at with regard to seatbelt enforcement is also at the night. I mean, that's a very difficult task to enforce seatbelt use at night. States have come up with ways. Mr. Banier was just explaining to me that in the state of Texas, they will actually use motor coaches as a tool to examine whether truck drivers are using their safety belts. That might be another way that allows you better access to the passengers to see what's happening. So the states have been very creative in dealing with this problem, mostly because they know that the primary enforcement of these seatbelt laws save lives. There has not been a study that I'm aware of that has shown that a state that's moved from secondary to primary enforcement of laws has seen either a decrease in seatbelt use or has seen an increase in fatalities related to non-use of seatbelts. So it's a positive measure that states can take.
Thank you, Member Weiner. Vice Chairman Denzar.
Thank you, Chairman Hart. Thanks to the staff for this very thorough report. I know you had to look at a lot of new issues and carefully at some issues, and so I commend you for that. And it couldn't have been more timely because this Sunday was actually the World Day of Remembrance for road traffic victims. So I think that the families of the students who were killed and those who were injured, I think this was a good time for us to report this. I can't stress enough my belief in and scientific evidence for primary seatbelt laws, but I'd like to ask you a question about another aspect of seatbelt use. A lot of the student athletes seem to have been lying down. Could you explain more about the effectiveness of seatbelts, or if there's any evidence related to that for people who might be lying down rather than appropriately seated?
That's a good question. We know that the seatbelts, if they were used, would have prevented ejection. But one of the concerns that we have, I think, is the point that you're bringing up, that if a seatbelt isn't used properly, it can also cause additional injury. So this medium-sized bus was equipped with lap-only belts. So you can envision a scenario where someone may lay down and buckle that seatbelt, but not have that seatbelt buckled properly. And when I talk about properly, I mean that the seatbelt has to be buckled over the bony surfaces of the body. So for a lap belt, we like to see it low and tight on the hips. If there's a shoulder belt included, we like to see that shoulder belt passing over the middle of the shoulder and across the breastbone so it can engage the bony surfaces of the body and restrain the body during a crash. If the seatbelt is over soft surfaces, soft portions of the body, you can actually cause additional injury. So that's the reason why we're making the recommendation that we want these medium-sized buses to be included in the motor coach standards for occupant protection, because those standards are including an integrated lap shoulder belt system, and we think with a well-designed system that you would have occupants that would stay within their seats and use that lap shoulder belt system. Staff has kind of discussed it similar to what we see with children. Like when I was a child, I would fall asleep and lay across the back seat. Now my children are restrained in a child restraint system. They still sleep, but they're properly restrained. And we hope with a well-designed lap shoulder belt system that the occupants would be able to be properly restrained, but could still be able to rest on these types of sporting trips.
Thank you, Dr. Poland. Your answer actually prompts me to think of another question about the medium-sized buses. So why doesn't NHTSA have crashworthiness standards for these medium-sized buses?
I think the medium-sized buses have been kind of a subsample of the buses that haven't been addressed so far. Motor coaches for a long time hadn't been addressed as well, and we were only seeing that school buses had standards for occupant protection and roof strength and joint strength. Just recently, as Mr. Kaminsky was bringing out, we have new standards for occupant protection systems on motor coaches because there's a recognition that there's a risk for these occupants. And now there's a proposed standard for roof integrity so that if the vehicle rolled over, occupants would also be protected, especially occupants that were belted inside the vehicle. Now what staff is trying to highlight is that these medium-sized buses are being operated in a similar manner as these motor coaches, and often they're less expensive than motor coaches, so people may be purchasing these instead of a motor coach to transport folks, and they're equally at risk in these types of vehicles. Sometimes these vehicles are even smaller, so in collisions like we saw in Davis, Oklahoma, they're at greater risk when they're impacted with a tractor trailer. And so we're trying to emphasize that point by having these vehicles be included in those new standards that we're seeing for motor coaches and other large, heavy buses.
So in a way, it seems like they've fallen through the cracks, the medium-sized buses. And I don't want to assume who is owning these buses or using these buses, but I mean, just in my anecdotal experience, I mean, it's my child's school or my nephews and nieces' sports teams. Could you tell me who are the primary users and owners?
It's varied. Just in my time in DC, we've seen that the population of buses has changed, where it used to be if you walked around DC, you would only see motor coaches as being the tour operators. And now you see many operators of medium-sized buses. But like you point out, some of them are the college schools that transport their students in these medium-sized buses. Sometimes it's the schools that perceive these as being somehow safer than a school bus and will use these instead of a school bus to transport their students. Sometimes you'll also see them for older adults, providing mobility for older adults. So it's a varied population that uses these buses, but we know that they're at risk because there aren't these crashworthiness standards and there aren't the requirements for occupant protection. And we think that they need to be protected.
And some of our most vulnerable users, it seems like, are being transported in these. Thank you, Dr. Poland.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I wanted to follow up on that. I too was concerned about the folks who were lying down, and I wondered, when the bus driver is taught tell everybody about their seatbelts, is there any training in that regard that relates to lying down?
No, other than just wearing their seatbelts was the direction that the driver is supposed to give to the students, passengers.
Do you know if there's any mention in the NCAA document about not sitting, about lying down?
No, there's not.
Okay,
just,
so
just
in addition,
proper use of the belts.
Okay, so in addition to having the belt, we need to figure out a way, because that's not an uncommon thing for people on long trips to want to lie down and go to sleep if there's room to do that. I see the same thing on airplanes. I know on airplanes they're not going to allow the takeoff and landing with someone lying down, but in flight, when there's turbulence and they say buckle the seatbelt, I've never seen anyone get anyone up who was lying down and say you got to sit up and use your seatbelt.
Right, and those seats that were on that bus did recline. So they could have just reclined and still worn their seatbelts properly.
Well, then that brings in another issue. If you recline the seat enough, can the seat belt, especially a lap-only belt, become ineffective? Because then you can submarine out of your belt. And is there any training regarding that issue?
It didn't lean back far enough. It only goes back about another 15 degrees.
Okay. Another issue that came to mind from the presentation was the reference to the driver's previous employer knowing about his use. And I wondered, walk me through the process. Is there any reporting requirement, or how could a subsequent employer find out from a previous employer about things of that sort that happened? Is there any way for that to occur?
Yes, sir. There's numerous procedures under the federal regulations that motor carriers that are subject to the regulations have to follow. And in this case, Quickway Transportation did do the adequate procedure of contacting the previous employers that the accident driver was employed with and got all that correspondence. In addition, they also received the information regarding his drug and alcohol testing, which all showed that the driver was in compliance and was negative in his drug testing.
I wonder in particular about an untested drug like this one. Would that show up in this process, or would that fall between the cracks?
Yes, sir, that would fall in between the cracks. The synthetic drugs, as mentioned in this presentation, are not covered under 40.85, which is the criteria for DOT drug testing. So that if the driver could openly use those drugs that are untested and not have to report, and wouldn't necessarily come to the attention of the first employer, so a second employer wouldn't necessarily find out about it either. Is that a fair statement? Yes, sir, that's correct.
Which then really illuminates the importance of the issue you're talking about how to address all this vast array of synthetic drugs.
Well, one of the things, Chairman Hart, is that goes directly towards our recommendation. This previous company had an awareness that there might be an issue regarding synthetic drugs. You know, there are limits because they couldn't actually show proof positive that he was using the drugs, so it makes carriers more reluctant to report that situation. We're hopeful that the FMCSA, working with the industry, can come up with ways to strengthen the reasonable suspicion testing or just methods for carriers to identify when their drivers are getting impaired by substances not currently tested for. So we do have a recommendation that we think will strengthen that and allow for reporting between carriers.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now begin with the board's second round of questions. Member Sumalt.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Webster, I want to talk to you about the testing for the synthetic cannabinoids. I worked on this actually this morning. Cannabinoid. No, well, anyway, the SC as we call it. So anyway, I promise I practiced that this morning. Anyway, so I think you pointed out that in one of your slides that you say that we were unable to confirm the presence or absence of 5-fluoro-AMB or its metabolites. So if we can't confirm that, how are we fairly certain that this was what inhibited the performance of the driver?
Thank you. This driver had a long history of using synthetic cannabinoids with evidence in the past of non-responsiveness, seizure-like activities as reported by his wife, degraded performance, and admitting to using this substance in the past while on the job. Additionally, the driver there was a pipe that was found in the truck with that synthetic cannabinoid present, and the combination of these issues and the effects, the known effects, though limited known, of synthetic cannabinoids leads us to believe that it is likely the driver was impaired by these synthetic substances, specifically 5-fluoro-AMB, at the time of the accident, even though testing did not specifically identify that compound. And one additional thing, testing is extremely difficult and complex. Science does not know how long the substance remains in the blood or what it breaks down to.
Cannabinoid. Okay. So, so talk about the difficulties with testing, because I think there was a spike, but it has to be, in order to show up as a positive drug test, it has to be 3 times that amount or something like that. Can you discuss that so I can have a better understanding of that?
When they do testing, they put it through a chromatograph and look for peaks which correspond to molecules with similar molecular weights. They did find a peak very similar to 5-fluoro-AMB, but because there was a lot of background noise in that area, they could not definitively say that this was 5-fluoro-AMB. Additionally, when they did the testing, they were able to identify potential breakdown products of that drug, the 5-fluoro-AMB. But there are no standards for those breakdown products. And even though they saw a peak where a potential breakdown product or metabolite might be, they were unable to confirm that that peak was the actual breakdown product. Therefore, they were unable to confirm the presence or absence of 5-fluoro-AMB in the blood.
Thank you for that explanation. You know, I think there's a major problem here. These synthetic drugs, designer drugs, they are easily obtainable. You can go into a convenience store. You can get them a lot of places. They are legally purchased as long as they're not used for human consumption. They cannot be detected in the DOT drug testing. And this driver knew that. He supposedly told the previous employer that he knew that they were not detectable in a drug test. And so, you know, as soon as law enforcement places one of these onto a Schedule 1, the manufacturers of the drugs modify the structure slightly to create a new drug with similar effects that won't show up on the drug test. And it's sort of like nailing Jell-O to a wall. You get just a little bit there, but a lot of other stuff slips through. So this is a problem. Let me ask you this. Is there a possibility that, you know, his wife reported seizure-like symptoms? Could he have had a seizure? Is that a feasible explanation? Is there? We talked about the cooler, reaching for the cooler. That probably wasn't a plausible explanation. How about a medical condition such as a seizure?
Well, he had an episode of non-responsiveness, but I think it's unlikely that he had a seizure. We looked at his current medications. We looked at the side effect of his current medications. And there is a slight risk that there could be a risk of a seizure with a combination of medications. But this did not fit a pattern that would be consistent with a seizure.
Thanks. It looks like we've got circumstantial evidence. But to be honest with you, I believe the circumstantial evidence. I do. There's too many things around this, and I think it is likely that he was impaired by the use of a synthetic, let's see if I can say it again, cannabinoid. Well, anyway, I can't say. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Member Sumalt. Member Weiner.
So we've talked about the difficulty in terms of doing testing to determine the presence or absence of cannabinoids. But you also talked about reasonable suspicion, basically determining that there was some impairment by observation. So how effective is this reasonable suspicion? Because according to the presentation, only 15.7% turned out to be positive. What does that mean?
Yes, sir. That 15.7% is the result of a recent FMCSA survey to the industry, to a select group of motor carriers in their response, saying that unfortunately the results for reasonable suspicion testing yielded only 15.7%.
Does that mean then that 84.3% of the times reasonable suspicion was flagged that there was not a drug in the system? In other words, we have a high false positive.
That may be true, sir, which leads us into our proposed recommendation that FMCSA should work with the industry to work on enhanced techniques for testing for reasonable suspicion, such as forward-facing cameras and the DRE training that law enforcement uses. So they may have more authority to, in this case, if the driver did test negative, that the motor carrier would have the authority to pull the driver off the road. Under the current regulations, they cannot.
Now, for
Member Weiner, just to add to that, it is possible that the low number of positives is a result of ineffective training, resulting in high rate of false alarms. But we believe it is much more likely that in those cases, drivers were impaired due to substances not tested under the current DOT regulations.
so the feeling is that the observations were accurate, but the determination of what the cause of the impairment was not accurate.
Correct. We still believe that reasonable suspicion type training could benefit from improvements, but we believe that motor carriers need additional tools to aid in addressing substances not currently tested.
So what's the difference between reasonable suspicion and the drug recognition expert training? Or
I'll let Mr. Fox answer that one.
Yes, sir. Under the current FMCSRs, motor carriers are required to have someone in their supervisory staff or management receive training for 1 hour for a drug and 1 hour for alcohol recognition impairment. DRE training is a completely separate law enforcement tool that requires 40 to 80 hours of training, and that falls under the criminal code versus the motor carrier that just has to see different behavior, body odors, speech impairment that leads them to believe the driver may be impaired.
so are we advocating going in the direction of the drug recognition experts?
Staff is proposing that motor carriers work with FMCSA to develop best practices so they may have more tools at their disposal and perhaps more authority so that they could stand down a driver if they, in this scenario, if the driver tested negative and the driver was still showing potential signs of impairment, they would have the authority to stand down the driver.
Okay, so a DRE, though, is authoritative to the point of being able to be used as evidence in court?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
So would we be going that far?
Staff is proposing numerous thoughts in this area. We don't know exactly what it would look like. That's why we're making the suggestion that FMCSA could work with industry to improve their reasonable suspicion training to include tactics or training similar to DRE training, to make it more extensive than just 1 hour, and currently does not have recurrent training in its requirement.
One thing I'd like to just add, actually, too, and I think, sometimes we somewhat overestimate the effects of the drugs in causing the impaired performance. Motor carriers may decide, as they're examining their drivers and they're showing poor performance, poor, timeliness and things like that for showing up to work or other behaviors, that it actually may be sleep deprivation problems, an apnea issue, could be other problems they're having at home. So some solutions may be beyond just looking for the drugs, but looking for what the underlying cause of that impairment of their performance is. So that's where I think it's not just DRE, but it's also, meeting with that person, trying to say, hey, we've identified a pattern of behavior that's indicating that you are a potential safety concern for us. Let's get to the bottom of this, and it's not, we've shown that it's not the impairment by the illegal drugs, but maybe there's something else in your life that's happening that's causing you not to be able to perform. So that's why we think having the motor carriers sit down with the FMCSA, and so we know some carriers are having better success. And one thing I do want to say, that there are actually good portions of the reasonable suspicion in the sense that random testing generally identifies less than 1% of drug users. So that 15.7 is a substantial increase over what random testing does find. But I think, again, we see some of it because of drugs that aren't detectable, some of it because the performance is being impaired by other psychological reasons, lack of sleep or other stress.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Weiner. Vice Chairman Denzar.
Thank you, Chairman. I believe this question is also for Mr. Fox, just to follow up on Member Weiner's line of questioning. You touched on this, but could you explain to me again what factors, I know you have a lot of experience as a terminal manager, what factors would a terminal manager take into account when recommending someone for reasonable suspicion testing?
Yes, ma'am, that's an excellent question. A manager or supervisor who is trained in reasonable suspicion training must be aware that the driver is exhibiting potential signs of impairment. that person has to have actual knowledge. They have to be able to witness this driver exhibiting these behaviors, body odors, erratic behavior, things that would indicate that that driver was under the influence. And at that point, the terminal manager or supervisor would have to write a written report and document that so that they are in compliance with the regulation, and then take the driver immediately to a drug and alcohol testing facility and have the driver tested at that time.
And practically speaking, what would be the challenges for a terminal manager to be able to do that or to get that information?
Well, as mentioned, the driver, or the supervisor or manager would have to be appropriately trained and witness this driver behaving this way, and then take him immediately to be tested. Additionally, there may be company policies and procedures that may be impacted by human resources. The driver may be under a union contract. There may be union guidelines as well. So there's a lot that is taking place with the terminal manager to make sure that all those boxes are checked before the driver is taken for a reasonable suspicion test, because there may be reprisals from the driver if the test is negative and he said, "You took me off the road, I didn't get a chance to drive today, and I didn't earn my living." You know, there could be other consequences that the terminal manager may have to incur.
And how much face time does a terminal manager have with drivers?
It can vary throughout the industry. A terminal, such as in this case with Quickway, where the drivers physically reported in for their dispatch, or there could be companies where the drivers are reporting just over their internet or through their cell phone and never see their terminal. So it varies throughout the country depending on the type of industry. In this particular case, the driver reported in.
But it's possible they don't have that much interaction.
Yes,
is that
ma'am.
correct?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Fox.
Yes, ma'am.
My next question, I believe, is for Mr. Walsh about the median barriers. You mentioned in your presentation that there's a draft recommendation related to median barriers and about this crash. Could you explain further about how this would have prevented a crash like this, or how this is going to advance safety?
Yes, Madam Vice Chairman. The recommendation we're making to the Federal Highway Administration provides the circumstances of the Davis, Oklahoma crash, as well as ODOT's median cable barrier guidelines. To those states that may be revising their median barrier guidelines and not wait until June of 2018 when NCHRP Project 22-31 will be completed. In this way, it provides an opportunity for those states to bring their median barrier guidelines up to par with states that have progressive median barrier guidelines, such as Oklahoma, California, and Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Finally, I have to ask a synthetic cannabinoids question as well for Dr. Webster, excuse me, Dr. Webster. So the effects of the synthetic cannabinoids seem to be different from regular marijuana. And if they're binding to the same receptors, can you explain why the effects are so different and possibly so much more dangerous?
Yes, I can. The synthetic cannabinoids are a variety of different chemicals that bind with different affinities or tightness to those receptors and bind for different amounts of time, stimulating them either just a little bit or a whole lot. When that occurs, the person has, as a result of this, the person has unpredictable responses to each package of synthetic cannabinoid. You don't know what's in that package, what the concentration in the package is, or what drug is in that package. So it's a very dangerous way of experimenting with your brain.
Thank you, Dr. Webster.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I'm going to follow on that line because I was very troubled to hear that you can buy this at a truck stop. There there's something really wrong with that picture, because that's who's going to be going to truck drivers. So is there anything we can do about? I mean, I guess these are so legal that they're just out and open. There's nothing we can do about it unless they're in a substance in category 1 or whatever. Just walk me through some of that conversation, because it was very troubling to hear that I can buy this at a truck stop.
Our recommendation, I believe it is number 6, that goes to, among other associations, to ATA, American Trucking Associations, where it talks about informing their members about dangers of use. One thing that associations such as the American Trucking Association could do would be to influence truck stop operators and owners to ban the sale of those substances.
Well, I can appreciate the magnitude of this challenge. This is amazing it's very scary to hear how widespread this is, how dynamic it is, how ever-changing it is, and the inability of the enforcement capabilities to keep up with that. So let me move on to the improvement of crashworthiness of the medium-sized buses. Do we have enough experience yet with motor coaches to know whether improving the crashworthiness of motor coaches in terms of roof strength and window ejection and things of that sort, is that a major re-engineering design, or is that minor modifications on the existing structures, or do we have any sense of that? Because my next question would be, I wonder how major change that would be for the medium-sized buses as well.
So for the motor coaches, we looked at this back in 1999 when we were first looking at these recommendations, and we found that already in Europe, a lot of the manufacturers of motor coaches were meeting similar standards. But the buses that were sold in the United States were not designed to meet these roof strength standards, any sort of occupant protection standards. So they didn't have the strength of the seats or the floor to be able to sustain the load of a seatbelt system. And they didn't have the structure, the type of ribbing or the continuous structure from the bottom of the motor coach all the way through to the roof to ensure that during a rollover, the motor coach could actually sustain the weight of the motor coach. But we know that it's certainly feasible, because, like I said, in Europe, we're seeing those designs are already in existence. For the medium-sized bus, I don't think it's something that would be a huge step as well. I think it's a design consideration. So for some of the vehicles, you would have to do some sort of a redesign. But it's just like an engineering problem. If you start from the beginning and you're looking at this design, it's certainly feasible, and it doesn't seem as though they're having to add a significant amount of weight to the vehicle to be able to achieve these type of crash-worthy designs.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have at this point. We're going to take a break, a 15-minute break, but before we do that, I want to see if any other members have any further questions. Any questions, Member Sumwalt, Member Weiner, Vice Chairman? Okay, Member Sumwalt.
Yeah, just a quick one. Mr. Walsh, to be clear, in Oklahoma, in the area of the crash, Oklahoma is going to install TL4 median barriers, I believe.
That's correct.
And to be clear about that, and I am a supporter of median barriers, but the TL4 is only designed to capture a 22,000-pound vehicle. What would the weight of an 18-wheeler like this one be? I realize it was empty in the back except for the trays, but what would the weight of that vehicle be?
The typical weight would be 79,000 pounds. NCHRP Project 22-31 will be addressing the issue that you point out, that median cable barriers will be crash tested, will be tested for 79,000-pound tractor trailers at speeds of 50 miles per hour and angles of impact of 15 degrees. So that will be analyzed as part of NCHRP Project 22-31.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Sumwalt. Member Weiner?
Yeah, I have a question regarding recorders and Mr. Harold Lampopoulos. In this particular case, we had a limited amount of data. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that data had to be retrieved from several different boxes?
The data that we actually collected One component was from a handheld GPS obtained from the driver's equipment found inside the truck. The other was from the subsystem of the Bendix ABS module that produced 2 seconds of data over 4 points.
Now, in terms of the systems on the truck, it's basically a federated system or distributed system. Is that correct? In other words, it's an assembly of devices all hooked by networks and talking with each other?
That is correct.
So there's really no one data collection point or data recording point. Is that true?
In regards to this, the accident vehicle, the data is captured through the ECM and also the cab electronic control unit. The supporting modules are there because in its function, in its primary function, it is searching for these other modules to make sure that the status of the system is healthy and intact. So if it detects that it's not there, it kind of shuts itself down or produces or induces more faults that kind of conflict with one of its recording functions.
Well, and I think that reflects the original design intent was to provide a system for operability of the vehicle and for troubleshooting the vehicle and so forth, not for recording crash circumstantial data. Our recommendations in the past seem to have been pointed toward at least in conceptual terms, a device where that device logs the data. And that sort of construct, that architecture is no longer relevant from what you describe.
Correct. These electronic devices are by no means dedicated event data recorders.
So if we're going to have recommendations related to, and we already have recommendations related to the specifications of the data recording as a data recording device, we probably need to broaden those to have a data recording system of devices because, as you point out, loss of one unit could cause overwriting of data in a process somewhere else in the system.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Member Weiner. Vice Chairman Denzar.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is about the joint strength standard for the buses. I believe in the draft report there's some discussion about the fact that even though it's not required to meet a certain joint strength standard, Champion Bus still tested some similar buses to the accident bus. There was also a discussion that the accident bus series didn't meet the school bus joint strength standard. Do we know how much lower the joint strength was on the accident bus or that type of bus?
We do have that data, and in some locations the joint strength was significantly lower than the strength of the panel. Just to give a little bit of history, in 1977, when school buses were being redesigned, they looked at school bus accidents to see where children were getting injured. And one of the things that they noticed was that sometimes during severe crashes, where two panels would come together on the sidewall of a school bus, the joints at some time during the crash would open up, and then a child may be partially or fully ejected, and sometimes they would even close back down, and children were getting injured in that way. And so they realized that this was a huge problem. And so in 1977, they came up with, in addition to compartmentalization and the roof strength standards for school buses, they came up with standards for joint strength. But what we've learned over time is that the school bus industry always goes above and beyond. So they have a very strong sidewall structure to start with. And as a result of these new standards from 1977, the joints are also extremely strong as well. So even when we've seen school buses impacted by tractor trailers over 80,000 pounds or trains, we see that these joints stay together, and the school bus body generally stays intact, unlike what we were seeing in this medium-sized bus, where an unloaded tractor trailer is impacting it in a side impact, glancing blow, and we see the whole sidewall ripped off. So for some of the places where they were testing this, to answer your question specifically, the joint strength was extremely low. But I think the point is that we're also looking at the structure of the body itself. And so it's not just necessarily meeting the school bus standard, but having something that's specific to the design of the medium-sized bus. Because just meeting that school bus standard may not ensure the crashworthiness of the medium-sized bus, because they're designed differently and the construction is different. The sidewall of the school bus is extremely strong. What we're seeing with these medium-sized buses is not a very strong panel structure.
Thank you for the clarification. I mean, whether it's a medium bus or a school bus or whatever type of school transport, I mean, obviously we need to make sure that they're engineered in the most protective way possible. So thank you.
Thank you. We will take a break before resuming deliberation, and we will return at 11:35 on the wall clock. Thank you. We're back in session. Deputy Managing Director Kleiss, please read the proposed findings so that we can prepare for deliberations.
As a result of this crash investigation, staff proposes 20 findings. First, none of the following were primary or contributory factors in the crash: truck or bus driver licensing and driver experience, bus driver distraction due to cell phone use, fatigue, substance abuse or medical conditions, motor carrier operations, mechanical condition of either vehicle, traffic hazards, or weather conditions. 2, although the emergency response deviated from the National Incident Management System and Incident Command System protocols in some instances, there was a delay in the transportation of one injured passenger. These circumstances did not affect the extent of the injuries to the occupants of either vehicle. 3, the truck driver's claim that he was reaching for a soft drink cannot account for his lack of corrective action following the roadway departure. 4, the lack of any type of evasive steering or braking by the truck driver while traveling across the median for more than 10 seconds and the full throttle following the impact with the medium-sized bus are inconsistent with a fatigue-related crash. 5, the truck driver's lack of corrective action following the roadway departure was due to incapacitation, likely from the use of synthetic cannabinoids. 6, there is a disconnect in the regulations between the drug prohibitions for commercial motor vehicle drivers found at 49 Code of Federal Regulations 392.4 and substances for which they are screened found in 40 CFR 40.85. Number 7, research is needed on the extent to which commercial motor vehicle drivers using pairing substances, particularly synthetic cannabinoids and other substances not tested for under 49 Code of Federal Regulations 40.85. 8, the incongruity between the trained visual detection of impairment and the results of drug and alcohol tests indicates a need for improved methods of addressing driver impairment. 9, to reduce the likelihood of drug-impaired driving, motor carriers should educate their drivers about the dangers of synthetic drugs. 10, the lack of seatbelt use likely exacerbated the injuries of passengers in the medium-sized bus. Number 11, although North Central Texas College had a policy requiring that drivers operate vehicles only if all passengers were wearing their seatbelts, the accident driver did not ensure that his passengers were wearing the available seatbelts, and the college had no procedure in place to ensure that its drivers complied with this policy. 12, junior colleges can improve transportation safety by following the travel policy guidelines developed by the National Collegiate Athletic Association. 13, extending the mandatory seatbelt use laws with primary enforcement to all vehicles in all states for all seating positions would decrease fatalities on the road. 14, the crashworthiness of mid-sized buses can be improved by requiring those vehicles to meet the existing motor coach occupant protection standards and the proposed rollover structural integrity standard. 15, because of the current lack of side impact protection standards for medium-sized buses, occupants are at risk of injury and ejection during side impact crashes. 16, because of power loss during the collision sequence, the truck tractor engine control unit did not record useful vehicle parameter data. 17, the driver of the truck tractor applied nearly full throttle for 1.5 to 2 seconds between colliding with the medium-sized bus and striking the trees. 18, because of the continued lack of standards and requirements for event data recorders in trucks and buses over 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating, Data that are crucial to the improved understanding of crashes, as well as to overall vehicle safety, continue to go unrecorded. 19, the advanced state medium cable barrier guidelines, which allow for installing barriers at locations where they were not previously considered, can help reduce the frequency of median crossover crashes. 20, the circumstances of the medium crossover crash in Davis, Oklahoma, together with the Oklahoma Department of Transportation median cable barrier guidelines, could provide state departments of transportation with crucial information to take the provisional steps before the completion of National Cooperative Highway Research Program Project 22-31.
Thank you. Before I ask for a motion on these findings, I have a question for clarification on number 17, and excuse me for not noticing it until just now. The driver of the tractor-trailer applied near full throttle for 1.5 to 2 seconds between colliding with the medium-sized bus and striking the trees. My question is, do we know that that was the driver applying full throttle, or could it have been cruise control causing full throttle? Do we know that with certainty?
Yes, we following the collision while we were at the Peterbilt facility doing the downloads on the modules, I also had the same question. And staff at that time, working with the PACCAR engineers, we equipped a similar truck, the exemplar truck, with telemetry, and did testing on their test track to show that the only way that that module could indicate an application of a throttle was with a manual, manual depression of the pedal. The cruise control would not cause that.
Okay, thank you, and I apologize for not asking that question until now. Is there a motion to adopt the findings as proposed? There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
The motion's been seconded. All those in favor signal with a hand and say aye. Aye. The vote is 4-0 in favor of adopting the findings as proposed. Deputy Managing Director Kleiss, please read the proposed probable cause.
Staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the Davis, Oklahoma crash was the failure of the truck-tractor driver to control his vehicle due to incapacitation, likely stemming from his use of synthetic cannabinoids. Contributing to the severity of the injuries was the lack of restraint use by bus passengers and the lack of appropriate crash worthiness standards for medium-sized buses.
Thank you, Mr. Kleiss. Is there a motion to adopt the probable cause as proposed? There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, the motion has been made and seconded. All those in favor of adopting the probable cause as proposed, please signal with a hand and say aye. Aye. The vote is 4-0 in favor of adopting the probable cause as proposed. Deputy Managing Director Kleiss, please read the proposed recommendations.
As a result of this crash investigation, staff proposes 7 new safety recommendations. To the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, there are 2 recommendations. First, determine the prevalence of commercial motor vehicle driver use of impairing substances, particularly synthetic cannabinoids and other substances not tested for under 49 Code of Federal Regulations 40.85, and develop a plan to reduce the use of such substances. The second recommendation, work with motor carrier industry stakeholders to develop a plan to aid motor carriers in addressing commercial motor vehicle driver use of impairing substances, particularly that those not covered under current drug testing regulations, such as promoting best practices by carriers, expanding impairment detection training and authority, and developing performance-based methods of evaluation. There is 1 recommendation being proposed to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Develop and require compliance with a side impact protection standard for all newly manufactured medium-sized buses, regardless of weight. 1 recommendation to the Federal Highway Administration. Disseminate information to the state departments of transportation about the circumstances of the Davis, Oklahoma crash and the Oklahoma Department of Transportation revised median carrier cable barrier guidelines that resulted in the installation of a median cable barrier at this crash site. To the 50 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico, enact legislation that provides for primary enforcement of a mandatory seatbelt use law for all vehicle seating positions equipped with a passenger restraint system. This recommendation supersedes Safety Recommendation H97-2. To the American Trucking Association, American Bus Association, United Motor Coach Association, Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, and Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, the following recommendation is proposed. Inform your members about the dangers of driver use of synthetic drugs and encourage them to take steps to prevent drivers from using these substances. To the American Association of Community Colleges, one proposed recommendation, urge your members to adopt and follow the National Collegiate Association's Safety in Student Transportation, a resource guide for colleges and universities. Staff also proposes reiteration of the following 9 previously issued safety recommendations. To the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, H99-54. Develop and implement in cooperation with other government agencies and industry standards for onboard recording of bus crash data that addresses, at a minimum, parameters to be recorded, data sampling rates, duration of recording, interface configurations, data storage format, incorporation of fleet management tools, fluid immersion survivability, impact shock survivability, crash and penetration survivability, fire survivability, independent power supply, and the ability to accommodate future requirements and technological advances. H10-3. In your rulemaking to improve motor coach roof strength, occupant protection, window glazing standards include all buses with a gross vehicle weight rating above 10,000 pounds, other than school buses. H10-7. Require that all buses over 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating be equipped with onboard recording systems that record vehicle parameters, including, at a minimum, lateral acceleration, longitudinal acceleration, vertical acceleration, heading, vehicle speed, engine speed, driver's seatbelt status, braking input, steering input, gear selection, turn signal status, left or right, brake light status, on and off, head tail light status, on or off, passenger door status, open or closed, emergency door status, open or closed, hazard light status, on or off, brake system status, normal or warning, and flashing red light status, on or off for school buses only. Record the status of additional seat belts, airbag deployment criteria, airbag deployment time, and airbag deployment energy. Record data at a sampling rate sufficient to define vehicle parameter dynamics and capable of preserving data in the event of a vehicle crash or an electrical power loss, and are mounted to the bus body, not the chassis, to ensure recording of necessary data to define bus body motion. H10-14. Develop and implement minimum performance standards for event data recorders for trucks with gross vehicle weight ratings over 10,000 pounds that address at a minimum the following elements: data parameters to be recorded, data sampling rates, duration of the recorded event, standardized or universal data imaging interface, data storage format, and device and data survivability for crush, impact, fluid exposure, and immersion, and thermal exposure. The standards should also require that the event data recorder be able to be able of capturing and preserving data in the case of a power interruption or loss, and of accommodating future requirements and technological advances such as flashable and/or reprogrammable operating software, system software, and/or firmware updates. H10-15. After establishing performance standards for event data recorders for trucks with gross vehicle weight ratings over 10,000 pounds, require that all such vehicles be equipped with event data recorders meeting these standards. To the Federal Highway Administration, H11-22. Work with the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials to identify cross-median crash rates that call for special consideration when selecting median barriers. H11-23, work with the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials to define the criteria for median barrier selection, including heavy vehicle traffic volume. To the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, H11-32, work with the Federal Highway Administration to identify cross-medium crash rates that call for special consideration when selecting median barriers, and publish the rates in the Roadside Design Guide. H11-33, work with the Federal Highway Administration to define the criteria for median barrier selection, including heavy vehicle traffic volume, and publish the criteria in the Roadside Design Guide. Finally, staff proposes to reclassify the following previously issued recommendation. To the governors and legislatures of the 50 states, U.S. territories, and the District of Columbia, H97-2, enact legislation that provides for primary enforcement of mandatory seatbelt use, including provisions such as imposition of driver license penalty points and appropriate fines, existing legal provisions that insulate people from the financial consequences of not wearing a seatbelt should be repealed. This recommendation is currently classified open, acceptable, alternate response. Staff proposes that it be reclassified as closed, superseded by recommendation 5, which I read earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Kleist. I'm aware of one amendment, and I will refer to Member Weiner to discuss that amendment. Member Weiner?
Yeah, and specifically the recommendation number 1 to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. I certainly understand the desire to determine the prevalence of commercial motor vehicle driver use of impairing substances, particularly synthetic cannabinoids. I'm wondering why the exclusion of gathering the same sort of data for those substances referred to in 40.85. Why wouldn't we want the whole enchilada, so to speak?
The synthetic cannabinoids are the primary focus of this investigation. However, staff is also extends the concern to other impairing substances not tested under current regulation, particularly other synthetic drugs. So we did not talk about bath salts and other synthetic stimulants, which are increasing in prevalence. So in this recommendation, we did not want to preclude FMCSA for examining prevalence of all impairing substances, including those which are currently tested, but we wanted to place the emphasis on synthetic cannabinoids and substances which are not currently tested, specifically because motor carriers currently lack any tools to address driver use of substances which are not tested under current DOT regulations.
Because I'm not sure I still understand. We want to do a study of prevalence of impairing substances.
So one of the issues.
Why not collect the whole? I mean, if you're going to go do a survey, why exclude a subset?
Member Weiner, I guess I don't understand your question. I don't see any exclusion in the way the recommendation is now written. What exclusion are you referring to?
Well, substances not tested for under 49 CFR 4085.
Okay, I guess I read that as an inclusion, saying let's not only test for the ones that we saw in this accident, but let's also test for other substances that aren't presently tested for in the CFR. I didn't see that as an exclusion. I saw that as an inclusion. I'm confused about what you're looking for.
Well, I guess if we can read it two different ways, it's not clear and it needs to be cleaned up somehow.
Are you looking for inclusion, or do you not want exclusion? You want inclusion? Is that what you're seeking?
I want to exclude the exclusion.
Okay, that was my confusion. I didn't see it as an exclusion. I saw it as an inclusion. Let me see what other members think of that.
I agree that if we remove the phrase that specifies the CFR, it would make things clearer and cleaner, and it would encompass all of the impairing substances, which I believe is what Member Weiner is trying to get the recommendation to read as just clearer, so that it doesn't look as though we are excluding the substances that are tested in the way it's written. It could be misinterpreted. Is that correct, Member Weiner?
Yes, that is what I was intending. In other words, if you're going to go out and do a study and you're going to focus on synthetic cannabinoids, but you want to look at other impairing substances, that's catching, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Then let's collect the information on all impairing substances, even though we may have, in the past, other ways of getting some information about some that are under 40.85. But for the purposes of this, if you're going to go out and get information, get all of the information. So it would read, determine the prevalence of commercial motor vehicle driver use of impairing substances, particularly synthetic cannabinoids, and develop a plan to reduce the use of such substances.
That's your motion.
So that's my motion.
Second.
And so the motion's been made and seconded. Let's open it up for discussion. What was the staff's intent with respect to this recommendation?
Certainly the staff understands the intent of the change. Staff's biggest concern was that right now, with regard to drugs that are currently tested, the FMCSA has a relatively good handle on what the failure rates are for drivers. Drivers are tested for those drugs. They are just now preparing the drug clearinghouse, in which other people will be have access to that information of the types of drugs that people are failing for the ones that are tested. Now, we have no problem with them including that. It's relatively low-hanging fruit for them because they already have the test results for that. And in fact, they have a really strong program for preventing their use, which is the testing for them and the disqualification if you're using those substances. The problem area was the ones that weren't tested, that we didn't know the prevalence, and we didn't know what a solution would be to address that. So that's where we made the distinction, but in fact, we have no concern with including the whole group and getting a good picture of impairing both for those that are tested and for those are not tested right now. But I think our real intent was to try and understand the part that we didn't understand. The parts for drug testing, there are reports put out on what substances people fail tests for. So that's already relatively known. But other than that, otherwise staff has got no concerns because I think the revision you suggest would still allow that testing and that type of research to take place.
So to enhance my understanding, you're saying we should look at not only substances not tested, we should look at substances tested as well. That's what you're saying. I get it. Okay, I understand. All right. Any further comments from the staff regarding that?
Like I said, I mean, the particular interest is the synthetics and other things like bath salts and certain opiates that aren't tested, but it can certainly be included in the whole program. So we, again, that would be a good way for them to actually highlight basically how much is known about the one they test for versus the ones they don't test for and the difficulties. Because I know in discussing with them things that aren't tested for, they were starting to scratch their heads of how we could go at it, and they had some good ideas of working with different health organizations to try and attack this issue and understand more about it. But like I said, I think it clears up the language, and I think it allows them to have be able to do a complete report of all impairing substances.
Okay, thank you. The motion's been seconded. Is there any further discussion by any board members? All right, the motion to amend finding number, recommendation number 1 has been seconded. All those in favor signal with a hand and say aye. Aye. The vote is 4-0 in favor of adopting recommendation number 1 as amended. Is there a motion to adopt the complete recommendations as amended? You're not on.
Second.
Okay, the motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor of adopting the recommendations as revised, signal with a hand and say aye. Aye. The vote is 4-0 in favor of adopting the recommendations as amended. Is there a motion to adopt the entire report as revised?
So moved.
Okay, the motion to adopt the report has been seconded. All those in favor signal with a hand and say aye. Aye. The vote is 4-0 in favor of adopting the report as revised. Do any board members wish to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Okay, hearing none. Is there any further discussion by any board members? In closing, I would like to recognize the hard work of the NTSB staff in producing this report and thank my fellow board members for their very thoughtful participation in the process, and especially thank Member Sumwalt for his participation and help on scene. This investigation touched on a variety of highway safety issues and resulted in many new and reiterated recommendations. This is the third highway crash that the NTSB has investigated this year in which the passengers did not use available restraint systems in commercial vehicles. Today, to reduce the effects of highway crashes, we have called for primary enforcement of seatbelt laws for every seating position with an available seatbelt. It takes time to enact and implement new laws, but when it comes to using seatbelts, passengers don't have to wait. They can reap the safety benefits immediately simply by using available restraints. When we ride in any vehicle equipped with restraint systems, we can choose to reduce our risks today. In commercial vehicles, we should buckle up just as most of us normally do and just as all of us should do in our own cars. Similarly, organizations such as colleges and churches that operate passenger vehicles should adopt and enforce best practices to ensure seatbelt use by every vehicle occupant on every trip. Seatbelts save lives in crashes, whether in the family car, a taxi, a limousine, or a bus, and no matter who is driving. More germane to the cause of this crash, we have recommended that trucking industry begin to apply what is known about driving under the influence of drugs. Current driver testing is a necessary safeguard, but additional approaches are needed to make progress in the battle against impairment in transportation. If today's recommendations are acted upon, the commercial trucking industry will take steps towards enhanced methods of preventing driving under the influence of drugs, thereby strengthening commercial trucking safety and helping to end substance impairment in transportation. There are many existing protections intended to prevent tragedies, such as the one that occurred in Davis, Oklahoma on the night of September 26, 2014. There are guidelines on the placement of median bearers. There are policies and laws on seatbelt use. There are protections against impaired drivers on our roads. But these existing protections were not strong enough, even taken together, to prevent the tragedy in Davis. Action on today's recommendations can strengthen present protections and put new protections in place. Thank you, and we stand adjourned.